All right, so we're gonna go ahead and start then. So we're team eight. I'm Annalie and Rodriguez, and our team members, excuse me, are James Shepard, Blaine Halmuda, and Morgan Peterman. And our client is Engedi Vineyard. So just a quick overview of our agenda for today. We're going over our recommended solution for our client and talk about the equipment for it, the procedures, the labor and training, the associated costs of that solution, and then move on to our economic analysis and talk about the source of costs and values, operating cost over life of investment, the initial investment, return on investment, and the solution comparison, and then a summary, our next steps, and questions at the end. So after reviewing our client's current use for the grape pomace, we recommended that out of our three solutions we had, that he proceed with the fertilizer solution. This is because it's a simple and easy implementation for our client. We will later on in the presentation discuss the equipment, procedures, labor, and costs associated for the solution and compare it to the others that were proposed. So for our equipment, the equipment varies for fertilizer production depending on the scale that our client is wanting to proceed with. So we know our client has a limiting budget and isn't wanting to do something that is very large scale. So for our client, we're recommending the use of pitchforks and shovels to cut the initial investment cost. So in this slide, we have the picture on the left, which is the equipment we're recommending for our client, which is just a simple shovel and pitchfork. Since he is simply just wanting to get rid of grape pomace and use it in his vineyard, the shovel and pitchfork is all he is really going to need for a small scale operation. Now, the picture on the right is a picture of a tractor with a turning attachment. So if our client chooses to eventually create more fertilizer for potential selling, he would have to make an investment into a turning attachment for his tractor. So the procedures and steps in creating fertilizer for grape pomace is one, gathering all the pomace that is produced, excuse me, after the wine production. Once the pomace is gathered, it needs to get piled into rows, or what is also called windrows, for drying. After the pomace has finished drying, then you can add chicken litter to it. After turning the litter and pomace mixture, it needs to be done weekly for about a week. For 1 or 2 months. Once that process is complete, then you can apply the fertilizer to the plants that you're wanting to fertilize or bag and sell. So the top picture is the pile of pomace and chicken litter mix in the turning process, and the bottom picture is just a picture of the windrows of the pomace drying. And now I'm going to pass it off to Cole to talk about labor.
Okay, so generally the most labor or the additional labor for this process does not really add much compared to what is currently going on. They still have to fertilize the vineyard. In this way, they're just kind of transitioning from a pre-made fertilizer to one that's made on the property, and that can be kind of marketed that way. This vineyard really prides itself on using environmentally friendly additives and fertilizers for for their grapes, and this would be definitely something that they could put on their website and be proud of, that they make their own fertilizer on site. Labor and training, the workers are going to need to know the components, first of all, of making this compost. So obviously you have your pomace that you're getting from your wine production. And then as Annalie said, you'll have to line it up in of where you're going to want to set up the compost, and then which you will add the chicken litter and green waste. Green waste is just an additional source of nitrogen, which you can get from grass trimmings or waste from garden, or even if they have any excess stems from the previous harvest of grapes, they could add that to the compost as well. Mixing is going to be the drawn out process for labor for the employees. This is going to have to be done over weeks and months to give enough air exposure to all of the contents of the compost. They'll have to do that once or twice a week for probably 30 minutes, depending on how many piles of compost they have. They just need to turn and really aerate the system. And then they're going to also need to pay attention to the moisture content. They're going to need to know that it needs to be about 40 to 60% moisture content for the piles. Increased moisture content, if they're getting over 60% or towards that number, it's going to lead to really foul smells, which could be a problem if they have guests on the property to tour the vineyard. So that would have to be the pile location needs to be strategically placed so that the wind isn't blowing it directly into the vineyard itself as it's producing that compost. So it needs to be kind of kept out of the way. And then decreased moisture content could be a problem, which would lead to low microbial action, which is going to basically render the compost useless and is not going to do well for the vineyard. And then overall, they're going to need to know the process of when the compost needs to be ready. Obviously, they're going to get the pomace after the harvest, but then they need to have that compost ready to be spread as long as when the grapes are growing for the next yield. The critical point for those grapes is going to be when they start to show bulbs, and that would be the point that the employees need to have the fertilizer ready, and so that it can be distributed in the vineyard. Next slide, please. So obviously, with this labor, it's not a lot of training that the employees would have to have. They can do those deeds alongside their general farm work, and if anything, they're not preparing the pre-made fertilizer. So this would just be a transition to this new duty for them. Another thing, like I said, the compost maintenance would be only a couple hours a week, and they can do that along with their general farm work. The spreading, they already have a tractor, and he already has a fertilizer spreader on the site as well. So again, this would be the same process that's currently going on. He's just using a different type of fertilizer. That tractor can also be used to maintain the compost piles. It can be used to load them into the fertilizer spreader. So we're not adding any additional equipment in that realm. Next slide, please. The associated cost, like I said, they're utilizing the current equipment and facilities on the site. This had limited additional labor and training, and you're actually saving money and not buying that pre-made fertilizer. So I know personally, I've talked to farmers around Milam County. I'm actually from Milam County, and we price chicken litter, and we buy the chicken litter for our hay fields. So I had a lot of contents into finding this information, and had a lot of farmers to talk to about how they've seen transitioning over to chicken litter. So the price is going to be $27 to $30 an acre, per ton, and that price is going to vary based on how far the chicken house is from the vineyard. So you're not really changing much cost in there. It's the $3, and there are plenty of chicken houses around Milam County and in the surrounding areas. So finding the right chicken house for this service is not going to be difficult for this vineyard. And the general recommendation is you want about 2 tons per acre. As we're on 3 acres for this vineyard, it's not an incredible cost that's added. And that service includes delivery and spreading for the chicken litter. So they will not have to go pick it up or anything like that. And the spreading is included if they would like to go ahead and have it ready for spreading with the compost. But generally, I think with this process, they would just need to drop it off where the piles are recommended for by the operator of the facility, and that cost would remain the same.
All right, so this is going to be like the segue into the economic analysis portion of our project. Firstly, we are going to compare the current fertilizer method that's being used by our client. So that he's buying the pre-made fertilizer, and we're going to compare that to our proposed method of fertilizing, so our solution with the chicken litter mix. After that, we're going to go into some implementation investments. Once again, that labor, training, tools, and equipment, and land development. And then we'll have a solution comparison and kind of why we chose the fertilizer mixture over, per se, like a weaker wine solution or a grapeseed oil. So, source of cost and values. In table 1, we can see that we're calculating annual cost of the chicken litter method. So this would be our proposed fertilizer method. We can see that the client has 3 acres. Like James said, 27 tons per 2 tons per acre. And this would be a semi-annual purchase that he would be doing. So 2 purchases per year. Would net this solution to cost $324 annually. And this is, like I said, our proposed solution. Then this goes into table 2, and this is examining the pre-made fertilizer method. So if our client is buying fertilizer from someone else, which is what they are currently doing, this same variables take place, the 3 acres. At this moment, it costs him $48 per ton per 2 acres. And once again, a semi-annual purchase, which would then cost him $576 per year. So right away, we can see that our method is going to save our client $252 annually. This would give him the chance to put that money, back into savings, to increase the size of his farm, maybe increase equipment, or whatever optimization he could get from this. If we look at a cost over life of investment, we can look at our chicken litter mix, and in 25 years, it would cost him $8,100 compared to the pre-made fertilizer mix of $14,400. This is a saving of $6,300 over the 25 years. And in 50 years, our client can see savings close to $13,000 saved that he can use for increasing operations, or increasing the output of this fertilizer to where he can maybe get to a point where he's selling it, or he can save it and just be good for his operations.
All right, so next we're going to be looking at the initial investment expenses. These are essentially just going to be any kind of upfront costs that we associate with choosing this new fertilization method. So first is labor and training. Like we'd mentioned earlier, there's going to be 2 workers, and they're each going to work an additional 2 hours each, which can be an extra 4 hours, per week of labor. Mixing the fertilizer is going to happen over the course of 6 weeks in the late winter and early spring to be ready for harvest in the middle of the spring. Those workers are going to be paid $15 an hour, so the total extra cost for labor here is going to be $360. Next, we're going to look at tools and equipment. As Annalie had mentioned, for the small scale process, we can really afford to cut costs here and just use a simple pitchfork and a shovel. The large scale process may involve a bigger team of tractors, but we won't have to worry about that right now with our client. So we allocated $50 right there. And then lastly, for the construction and the clearing of land, any kind of redevelopment on the property that we're going to be needing to do, just to store the fertilizer and to mix it. We're basically just going to allocate $200 for that cost as well. So up front, it's just a simple $610 investment. So right here we can use all the values that Blaine just mentioned to calculate the return on investment. So we use those annual operating costs to determine the slope for those lines. $576 annually for the current or the original method, and then $324 annually for the proposed method for the homemade fertilizer. And then we'll use the initial investment expenses, like I just mentioned, determine the y-intercept, which is going to be $610. So the blue line right there in the middle represents the current track of fertilizer expenses from our client, and then the purple line represents the proposed expenses. The lines intersect at about 2.5 years and $1,400. So that means that it'll take approximately 2.5 or 2.5 years for the proposed solution to begin its payback. And at this point, approximately $1,400 will have been expensed for fertilizer. After the first 2.5 years, Engedi Vineyards will begin to reap the benefits of the what Cole mentioned, or what Blaine mentioned, was the $250 in annual savings that our team proposed. And then lastly, we just want to hit on the solution comparison. These were the comparisons that we mentioned in our last progress report. Other solutions we mentioned in our previous progress report, and why we ended up not choosing those. So firstly, for the grapeseed oil, the first negative against this idea was the high upfront cost. It's a very complicated process that involves pressing the grape promise, separating the seeds, and heating the mixture to extract the oil. So the necessary equipment to perform these tasks totals over about $500,000. Secondly, the process demands a massive amount of pomace. If the business were to open specifically for the purpose of making just a grapeseed oil, then they could justify using their entire supply of grapes on this. But for our client who already has an established winemaking business, this isn't necessarily a feasible side job to make a little extra revenue. Another solution we were looking at was weaker wine, which was essentially a diluted version of the red and white vines that our Engedi Vineyards already produces. There's no extra overhead cost or implementation cost because the process is so closely resembles the existing process. The downside of this idea then is that it requires more room on the client's property. Basically, you're doubling the infrastructure needed to make wine because you're making the existing red wine and then putting that pomace through a second process and making wine a second time. The vineyard would either need to double in size or cut its current system in half. Next, the market surrounding weaker wine is unknown and unestablished, especially when comparing against the products that Engedi is already making. There's a lot of research involved, and there's too much research for such a small market share that our team really can't justify reaching out to develop a new product. So in summary, we compared those three economic solutions, just comparing just to verify that the fertilizer method is the one that in fact we do want to go with. We did conclude that because of the low cost of implementation and the early payback schedule. Like we said, that there's a cheap cost of implementation, which was just the $600 up front. And then there's an early payback schedule of 2.5 years. So our next steps are to finish the final draft of the economic analysis and turn that in today, April 1st. We'll be working on the risk and implementation plan next, and that draft is going to be due next week on April 8th. Our next progress report is going to be on April 13th, and before April 14th, we'll be meeting with our faculty advisor to just discuss further plans here.
Okay, let's hear from Team 6.
I have I'm sorry, go ahead, Michelle.
Oh, I was just gonna say I really liked y'all's return on investment break even chart. I thought it was a good visual representation.
I have a couple questions. I probably missed it. How much fertilizer are you guys going to produce per year?
So that would be depending on how much chicken litter we would need. The pomace, I can't. I'd probably need it to be in there. I can't pull it from the last one that we had it in the last progress report. But we're gonna need about 2 tons of the chicken litter per acre, and then that will be mixed with the pomace yield.
Okay.
My apologies. That should have been added there.
Oh, no worries. And Are you guys going to produce enough to completely offset the use of pre-made fertilizer?
Yes.
Okay. Are you guys going to be making a surplus, or are you guys just making just enough to cover your own fertilizer needs?
We would expect that there would be somewhat of a surplus. It would have to be. We need to look into it to a little bit more to see what the actual yield is compared to the pomace to chicken litter ratio. But we would hope that there would be a surplus that they could potentially bag or just have left over for the next harvest crops or to add to the next compost mix.
Okay, awesome.
I just want to say I liked how y'all compared the price of the pre-made fertilizer to the chicken litter. Those calculations alongside each other so you can see the savings rather than just comparing like the end costs. And like Michelle said, the return on investment was cool to see in a graph like that.
So y'all talked a lot about cost during your presentation, and that explanation was great, but you typically use a fertilizer when your soil is lacking in certain types of nutrients. So aside from cost, what other benefits is the chicken litter giving you that the pre-made fertilizers aren't? Are we expected to have a greater yield, or is it one-to-one going to do about the same, just cheaper?
I don't mean to keep jumping on all the questions, but I if someone can add on this one also. But from my personal experience, the chicken litter has added a lot of higher yields per acre. And on our cropland and things, I'm not growing grapes, obviously. So we need to reach out a little bit more and do how that affects the grapes. But chicken litter has very high amounts of potassium and phosphorus, which is a huge component of the fertilizer, and then that's why the pumice is such a good addition to that, and the compost as far as like the green waste and everything that really brings into your nitrogen and gives you your a good ratio of potassium, phosphorus, and nitrogen. So that's what we're looking for in fertilizer, but it definitely needs to be made that comparison known of how. And I think that would probably be go in our next in our risk analysis to see if we're losing any added benefits from the pre-made fertilizer that we wouldn't be getting from our chicken litter and pumice compost.
Okay, those are good questions and comments. Let's see if Dr. Castell would like to make her comments.
Okay, another one. Good team. Good job. Good presentation. Well organized, well distributed, the usual. So great job. I had a question, and I think Austin asked that amount. How much are you making? And more importantly, and that relates to Zach's question, what is the composition of your compost, right? And you answer very well, James. The ratio of nitrogen, potassium, and phosphorus is important for high yield. I would have liked to see there's a basic material balance here. How much do you use 2 tons of the chicken litter? How much of the pumice you need to add to have the right ratios of the nutrients? And that would have been very clear in your presentation, and people will see the benefits right away. So I suggest if you haven't done that, or get with the brain team to get that information that is justify why do you need 2 tons of chicken litter, right, per acre and so forth. And one more thing I'm going to say, can you go back to that return of investment graph? And I like that you did that, but it has no labels. I had to figure out what is X, what is Y. So you know what it means. I displayed it very well, but I would suggest you add the labels. I'm assuming X is years, right? And Y is dollars. Is that the way of reading this graph? Yes? Okay, so but
Yes,
you make
ma'am.
me work here. You make me do the work, and you should have made it easy for me, right? So make sure you're labeling your graph. But I like that you use that, but very clear and really good use of graphs. So anyway, great job, June. Congratulations. Remember the material balances and numbers for this presentation. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, those were right along the line with the questions I had. It's a good presentation. Big picture, you have answered the question of the client. What am I going to do with all this grape pumice? You came up with 3 options. You went with the one that was the simplest and really the least expensive. And you know what? And you justified it. There were some other high-end solutions that Morgan talked about that y'all considered, but I really like the way that you preempted the client solution. Why am I going with the cheapest one? Well, that was good. So now you've put yourself into the recommended solution of we're going to use it as composting. Let me ask a question. What's the difference between fertilizer and compost? Anybody? Are those two things the same?
They should be, how they're produced, yes, they should be relatively the same, depending on what components are used, but they're trying to reach that nitrogen, potassium, phosphorus ratio.
Okay, and I'm not sure I've got a technically correct answer to that question, but I would be careful with using those two terms synonymously. Fertilizer has some, well, let's just say it's got some social baggage to it. So particularly when you're dealing with vineyards and people who are really environmentally conscious, fertilizer is usually produced through petroleum products, where you use a petroleum-based chemical to get the right N, P, and K. And some people don't like to put petroleum synthetic fertilizer on their cropland. And vineyards may be one of those. So I'd be careful with the use of the term fertilizer. Whereas compost sounds much more natural and environmentally friendly, particularly when you're using a biomass. You know, that's a mixture of biomasses to produce another nutrient, which is not, and I would argue that compost is more than fertilizer. It has a fertilizing function, but compost, more than what it does that fertilizer does not, is it also adds organic matter back to the soil, and the benefits of organic matter are many. So, and maybe that's a marketing aspect to it, but I would probably lean, if I was trying to sell this, I'd say we're making compost, and you can use it to put on your crop. And so my next question was kind of along the lines of that's already been asked here, is what is the nutrient requirements for the grapes? And does this compost with grape pumice meet that nutrient requirement? Since you have gone down this recommended solution that's fertilizer intensive, you have to answer those questions. So that, as a client, I would want to know, you're recommending I replace, apparently the client is using chicken litter now on his grapes. Is that right?
No, sir. He's buying pre-made fertilizer.
Okay. So he's not buying any chicken litter right now?
No, sir.
Okay. And so that's the second thing I would ask is, well, if you're putting together a recipe for me, right now all I know is I'm going to take some volume of grape pumice and some volume of chicken litter, and I think it was 2 tons, but I don't know what the ratio is. So don't make me figure out how to build it. That's your job. The recommended solution is not well enough developed with, guess what, numbers, okay? So we need more numbers in the recommended solution. How much grape pumice does this winery produce every year? What would be the correct amount of chicken litter to mix with it? That kind of thing. So I think James mentioned there are numerous sources of the chicken litter nearby. I hope that you don't make the client go find one. Give him 3 that are good candidates, so he doesn't have to go find one. Okay, you know them. Just make sure you tell the client what that is. There was some discrepancy in the cost. Let's go to James. You had a slide toward the end of your part of the presentation about associated costs, and I think you may have corrected yourself verbally. And then, so is it $27 to $30 an acre, or $27 to $30 a ton? Which is it?
It's per ton. That was a typo. You're right. I caught it as I was speaking. I should have noted that.
Okay.
It's $27 to $30 per ton, and you need 2 tons per acre. Is the recommendation.
And how many acres is the vineyard going to be applying the fertilizer to?
It's on 3 acres.
3 acres. Okay. So this is still pretty small scale. Other components of your solution. Annalie began with we're going to use a pitchfork and shovels. How much? What is the volume of compost that you're going to be producing annually? I think, is it measured in pounds or tons? Because if it's measured in tons, I'm not sure pitchforks and shovels are the way to go. There are other attachments you can put on a tractor for compost mixing that aren't the big windrow thing. There are forks that you can use to mix the compost. So you may want to scale that up a little bit. So yeah, it's a good presentation, kind of long, 19 minutes, but very thorough. But as we pointed out here, it was thorough in areas, but not thorough enough in some areas. So I think you need to go back and take the guesswork out for your client, add some numbers to that recommended solution. What are some things I wrote down here? So just see if you can answer this question. How much pumice do you expect to be produced annually from this great production, from this vineyard?
I don't know the exact number, but we would, I think in the last presentation, it would be around for the grapes, it's 30% of that yield. So if they're doing 10 tons per acre, then we would have 3 tons of the pomace.
Okay, that's a good starting point, and you can estimate that, or you could go to your client and find specifically what that is.
I have a more specific number for that. So for 1 ton of grapes, we are expecting 572 pounds of pomace. So yield.
Okay, so about a quarter of it. Okay, that's still pretty close, about 30%. You're right. So use those numbers. Do that math. Show that work in your paper and in your presentation. That will really add to the credibility of this, and your client won't be going, well, how much do I need to? How much chicken litter do I need to buy? And I think you need to. That's the big thing. If I was the client, I'd be going, okay, well, I've got this much pumice. How much litter do I need to add to it? And is that going to fertilize my grapes properly? Is that going to have the most nutrients? So you've got a good concept, but right now it's just a concept. It's not really a solution. For it to be a solution, you got to make the recipe. So tell the client what the recipe is for this compost. I thought the economic analysis was kind of based on the savings, and as you mentioned, the economic analysis is going to be pretty simple. Go back to the slide that Dr. Costello pointed out with the graph. There was one other thing I was curious about. So obviously the scale begins not at 0 here on the dollar side, but the y-intercept is 610. So I'm assuming that's here, but I'm not sure what's going on here.
Yes, sir. I think I just had an error. The window, obviously, like you said, on the x-axis doesn't go all the way to 0, and so it's kind of not the most accurate graph right there. I should have skewed the window farther to the left.
Okay, so really nice attempt, but you lost out in the specifics of it. So be precise when you put things like this up. Okay, any other comments, Young? Good. Yeah, it's a good presentation. I think you guys have you're on track to a good solution. Just make sure it's developed enough to get the client confidence in your solution.